The night began like every other, quiet, controlled, and painfully ordinary. Ilera Voss had built her life around that kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind people longed for, but the careful, deliberate kind. The kind that kept questions away. The kind that made sure no one looked too closely. She had learned, over the years, that invisibility wasn't just safety. It was survival. Her apartment sat on the edge of the city, far from noise, far from attention. Minimal furniture, neutral colors, no personal photographs. Nothing that told a story. Nothing that invited one. Because stories led to questions. And questions led to the past. She moved through her evening with practiced precision, locking the door twice, checking the windows, keeping the lights low. Every action was instinctive, embedded deep into her routine. But tonight, something fell off. Not enough to name, just enough to notice. A faint tension lingered in her chest, like a thread pulled too tight. She paused near the kitchen counter, her fingers resting lightly against the surface as her eyes drifted toward the window. Dark, still, normal, and yet not. Ilera exhaled slowly, forcing herself to move again. Paranoia was a dangerous habit. It made people careless in different ways. She had worked too hard to stay grounded, to stay in control. Still, her hand hesitated just slightly as she reached for her glass of water. There was again that feeling, like something unseen had shifted. An emotional hook pulled sharply through her thoughts. The most dangerous moment in a person's life isn't when they're in danger. It's when they sense it too late. The glass slipped slightly in her grip. And then, a sound. Soft. Almost nothing. But not nothing. Ilera froze. Every muscle in her body tightened instantly, her breath catching halfway in her lungs. Her eyes flicked toward the door. Silence. Then, a second sound. Closer. Not imagination. Not paranoia. Real. Her pulse spiked. Years of instinct snapped into place faster than fear could fully form. She didn't scream. Didn't move wildly. Didn't panic. She listened. Measured. Counted. 1 step. 2. A shift of weight just outside her door. Someone was there. Her mind raced, not chaotically, but sharply. Calculating. Assessing. This wasn't random. Nothing about this felt random. Her gaze scanned the room quickly, landing on a small, nearly invisible knife tucked beneath the edge of the counter. She reached for it slowly, silently, her fingers closing around the handle. The air changed. It was subtle but undeniable, like the space itself had been claimed. And then, the lock clicked. Once, twice. A clean, precise sound. Not forced. Opened. Ilera's stomach dropped. That wasn't break-in. That was access. The door opened without hesitation, and they moved like shadows. 3 of them, dressed in dark, unmarked clothing. No wasted motion. No voices. No hesitation. Professionals. Ilera reacted instantly. She didn't wait. Didn't question. She moved. The knife flashed in her hand as she lunged toward the closest figure. Not out of desperation, but calculation. A distraction. A chance. But they were faster. 1 step. 1 movement. Her wrist was caught mid-strike. The knife clattered to the floor. A hand closed firmly around her arm, twisting just enough to disarm her without breaking anything. Controlled. Efficient. Intentional. Her breath hitched, but she didn't fight blindly. She adjusted, shifting her weight, trying to pull free, but another hand caught her shoulder. Pinned. Not violently, but completely. Quiet, one of them said. The voice was low, calm, almost indifferent. Not angry, not rushed. That was what made it worse. Ilera stilled, not in surrender, but in awareness, because this wasn't chaos. This was planned. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as her eyes locked onto the man holding her. No mistakes, he added. Not to her, to the others. A confirmation. A warning. They weren't here to harm her randomly. They were here for her. That realization settled cold and heavy in her chest. I think you have the wrong, she started, her voice steady despite the pressure tightening around her. You're Ilera Voss. The man interrupted. Not a question. A fact. Her blood ran cold. Because they didn't hesitate. when they said her name. They didn't check. They didn't confirm. They already knew. This wasn't chance. This wasn't coincidence. This was selection. Fear crept in then, not loud or overwhelming, but sharp and focused, because random danger could be escaped. Planned danger was something else entirely. Her mind raced through possibilities, mistakes, old connections, things she had buried, erased, walked away from. None of them should have led here. None of them should have found her. And yet, they had. A cloth was pulled tight around her wrists, binding them with quick precision. Not rough, not sloppy. Exact. Everything about this was exact. Move, the man said. Ilera didn't resist again. Not because she had given up, but because she understood something critical in that moment. Resistance without information was useless. Survival meant waiting, watching, learning. They guided her out of the apartment swiftly, their movements synchronized. The hallway was empty, too empty. No witnesses, no interruptions. Of course, they had planned for that too. Outside, a black vehicle waited. Engine running, doors already open. Timing, precision, control. They push her inside. The door shut, and just like that, her world disappeared. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows as the car moved quickly, smoothly, without drawing attention. No sirens, no sudden turns, no panic, just quiet, calculated movement. Ilera sat still, her hands bound, her mind sharper than ever. She forced herself to breathe evenly, to slow her pulse, to think. Who would want her? The question echoed, louder with every passing second, because she had spent years making sure the answer was no one. Her life was small, careful, disconnected, by design. So how? A name surfaced in her mind, not fully formed, just a shadow of a thought. And with it, that familiar, buried tension she had spent years ignoring. Her jaw tightened. No, that part of her life was over, gone. It had to be. The car slowed, then stopped. Her body tensed automatically as the door opened. Cold air rushed in, different from before. Heavier, quieter, isolated. They pulled her out, guiding her forward without a word. Her eyes adjusted quickly, scanning her surroundings. A large structure, industrial, remote, no visible markings, no easy exits. This wasn't just a holding place. This was controlled territory. As they moved her inside, the atmosphere shifted again, thicker, more oppressive, the kind of place where decisions were made and rarely undone. Her steps slowed slightly, not from hesitation, from awareness, because something about this place felt familiar, not in detail, but in feeling, and that terrified her more than anything else. They led her down a long corridor, stopping finally in front of a large, closed door. One of the men knocked once. A pause. Then, "Bring her in." The voice came from inside. Deep, calm, unmistakably controlled. Ilera's breath caught, because something about that voice, something buried deep in her memory, recognized it. The door opened, and as they pushed her forward into the room, her entire body went still, not from fear, from something else, something sharper, something colder. Because standing in front of her wasn't just a powerful man, wasn't just the one who ordered her kidnapping. He was something far worse. Someone her past had never truly let her escape. And in that moment, Ilera Voss realized the truth she'd been running from had finally caught up to her. And the man who now owned her fate already knew exactly who she was. The door closed behind her with a quiet finality that felt louder than any gunshot. Ilera didn't move immediately. She didn't need to, because the moment she stepped into the room, the air itself had changed. Heavier, sharper, controlled by something far more dangerous than the men who had taken her. It was him, Adrian Cross. Even without seeing him fully, his presence was unmistakable. It filled the space with a kind of authority that didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, and everything else adjusted around it. Ilera lifted her gaze slowly, and there he was, seated behind a dark, polished desk, his posture relaxed but deliberate, as if even stillness was something he controlled. His expression was unreadable, carved from something colder than indifference. Not emotionless, just precise, calculated. His eyes, however, they were not calm. They were assessing, sharp enough to strip someone down to their truth without a single word. This was a man who didn't guess. He knew. An emotional hook tightened quietly beneath the surface of the moment. The most dangerous men aren't the ones who lose control. They're the ones who never do. And Adrian Cross had built an empire on that exact principle. His name alone carried weight in places Alara had spent years avoiding. A name spoken carefully. A name tied to disappearances, silent wars, and decisions that ended lives before they began. He wasn't just powerful. He was absolute. No weakness. No hesitation. No second chances. That was his rule. That was why he was still alive. The men who brought her and stepped aside. But they didn't leave. They remained close enough to act. Far enough not to interfere. Because even they understood, nothing in this room moved without Adrian's permission. Alara stood where they had placed her, her hands still bound, her pulse steadying despite everything inside her demanding otherwise. She refused to look small, refused to break. If this was the man who had ordered her taken, then she would face him as something more than just a victim. Adrian's gaze finally settled on her fully, and for a moment, time fractured. It wasn't visible to anyone else. Not immediately, but something happened, something subtle. Something impossible, because Adrian Cross, the man who never hesitated, stopped, not physically, not obviously, but internally, completely. His eyes locked onto her face, and didn't move. The room felt it before it understood it. A shift, a pause that shouldn't exist, because Adrian didn't pause. He decided, instantly, always, but now, he didn't. Alara felt it too. That strange, suspended moment where something unspoken passed between them. Not recognition. Not fully, but something close enough to unsettle her. His gaze didn't feel like evaluation anymore. It felt like conflict, a flicker, brief, controlled. But there, gone as quickly as it appeared, but not unnoticed. One of the men near the wall shifted slightly, his posture tightening. Another glance at Adrian, just for a second too long. Because they saw it. Not clearly, but enough. And that alone was dangerous. Adrian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. His fingers, resting lightly against the desk, curled once, slowly, deliberately, as if grounding himself back into control. Then he stood. The movement was smooth, precise, reclaiming the authority that had slipped for that fraction of a second. But it wasn't enough to erase it, because once something breaks, even slightly, it leaves a mark. He walked toward her, each step measured, each movement intentional. The distance between them closed quickly, but it felt longer, stretched by tension, by something neither of them fully understood. Alara held her ground, even as her instincts screamed at her to step back, even as something deep inside her whispered that this man, this exact man, was not unfamiliar. Adrian stopped just in front of her, close enough to see every detail, every line, every truth she didn't speak. His gaze traced her face again, slower this time, more deliberate, searching, and for the first time, there was something dangerously close to disbelief in his eyes. Not confusion, not uncertainty, recognition. But it made no sense, because that wasn't possible. It couldn't be. She's the one of the men said quietly from behind. A confirmation, a closure. But Adrian didn't respond, didn't acknowledge it, because he was still looking at her, still caught in something that didn't fit into his world of logic and control. Alara felt it then, that shift in power. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to understand one thing. This wasn't going the way it was supposed to. You're certain? Adrian finally asked. His voice was calm, controlled, but there was something beneath it, something tighter. The man behind her nodded. No mistake. Adrian's gaze didn't leave her, not once, because the mistake wasn't in her identity. The mistake was in what she represented, and that was something no one else in the room understood. Alara's breath slowed, not from calm, but from awareness, because now she knew. This man, this untouchable, unshakable man, was reacting to her, not as a target, but as something else entirely. "What is this?" she asked quietly. Her voice didn't tremble, didn't break, and that alone shifted something again. Adrian's eyes flickered, just slightly, because most people didn't speak to him like that. Not here, not like this, but she did, and she didn't even know why. Another silence stretched between them, heavy, unresolved. Then Adrian stepped back, not far, but enough to create space, enough to breathe, a decision forming, but slower than it should have been. And that was the problem, because Adrian Cross didn't take time to decide. He acted, immediately, always, until now. "Remove the restraints," he said. The order landed sharply in the room. Unexpected, the men hesitated, not because they would disobey, but because this wasn't procedure. This wasn't how it worked. But Adrian didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. Within seconds, the bindings around Alara's wrists were cut loose. Her hands fell to her sides, free, but she didn't move them, didn't react, because this wasn't safety. This was something else, something far more complicated. Her eyes stayed on him, and his never left her. The tension in the room thickened, because now it was undeniable. Something was wrong, not with her, with him, and that was far more dangerous. "Leave us," Adrian said. Another command, another break from expectation. This time, the hesitation lasted longer, because no one was ever left alone with an unknown variable. Not by him, not like this. But again, no one argued. The room cleared quickly, though not without glances, questions, silent calculations, until finally they were alone. The door shut, and the silence that followed was different. Not tense, not crowded, just sharp, focused. Adrian exhaled slowly, the sound almost unnoticeable, but real, human, and that alone shifted something again. "You shouldn't exist," he said. The words weren't hostile. They weren't confused. They were factual, and somehow that made them more unsettling. Alara's brows drew together slightly. That's not exactly reassuring. Adrian studied her, closer now, without interruption, without witnesses. "Your face," he continued quietly, "belongs to someone who died a long time ago." The words settled heavily between them. Alara felt it, deep, instinctive, that same tension from earlier, that same buried fear, because something inside her, something she had never been able to explain, reacted hard. "You're wrong," she said. But even as she spoke, she wasn't entirely sure. Adrian's gaze sharpened. "No," he said, "I'm not." And the certainty in his voice wasn't arrogance. It was memory, a dangerous, undeniable memory. Alara's chest tightened, because whatever this was, it wasn't random. It wasn't coincidence. And it wasn't over. Not even close. Adrian stepped back again, his expression hardening. Not into coldness, but into something more controlled, more dangerous. Because now he was thinking. And when men like him thought, things changed. Everything changed. "You were taken for a reason," he said, "but it's not the one they think." Alara's pulse quickened. "What does that mean?" Adrian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, his gaze shifting just enough to show he was already moving ahead, already calculating outcomes, consequences, possibilities. Because that was who he was. A strategist, a man who didn't react, a man who controlled. Except something about her had disrupted that, and he didn't like it. Not at all. Finally, he looked back at her, and this time, there was no hesitation left on the surface. Only decision. Cold, clear, final, but different. "Everything about this just changed," he said. And Alara felt it. The shift, the weight, the danger. Because whatever she had walked into, it was no longer just about her survival. It was about something far bigger, something buried, something powerful, and something that had just been awakened. Adrian turned toward the door. His voice, when he spoke next, carried its usual authority again. Controlled, unshaken, absolute. "Cancel the execution," he ordered. A pause. Shock. Then, Yes, sir. The response came quickly, but the disbelief behind it was impossible to hide, because this didn't happen. Not ever. Adrian Cross did not cancel decisions. He did not reconsider outcomes. He did not hesitate. But tonight, he had, because of her face. And as Alara stood there, trying to understand the storm she had just stepped into, she realized something far more dangerous than being kidnapped. The man who held her life in his hands had just broken his own rule, and that meant whatever came next would be far more unpredictable than anything she could survive. The silence that followed his order didn't feel like relief. It felt like distortion, as if something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface of reality, and neither of them fully understood what it meant yet. Alara stood where he had left her, her wrists no longer bound, but the sense of captivity hadn't changed. If anything, it had deepened, because now the danger wasn't physical. It was psychological, unpredictable, and entirely centered on her. Across the room, Adrian Cross had turned away, but not completely. His posture remained controlled, precise, yet something in the stillness of his shoulders suggested tension he wasn't allowing to surface. He had regained control, but not entirely, because control, once fractured, never returned the same. An emotional hook threaded quietly through the moment. Some truths don't break you when you hear them. They break you when you recognize them. And Adrian had recognized something he hadn't expected to ever see again. His gaze shifted back to her, not abruptly, not aggressively, but inevitably, drawn, like something unfinished had resurfaced. Alara felt again. That same strange pull, the same unspoken connection she couldn't explain. It wasn't familiarity in the way people understood it. It was deeper, more instinctive, and far more dangerous. "You keep looking at me like I'm someone else," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was an edge beneath it now, because confusion had limits, and hers was beginning to sharpen into something more focused. Adrian didn't answer immediately, because the truth wasn't something he could give her. Not yet. Not when he didn't fully understand it himself. Instead, he studied her again, not as a captor, not even as a threat, but as a question. And Adrian Cross did not tolerate unanswered questions. "You shouldn't look like her," he said finally. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. Alara's expression tightened slightly. "Like who?" A pause. Brief. Measured. Someone who's been dead for years. The room seemed to close in around that sentence. Not dramatically, but subtly, as if the air itself had shifted in response. Alara's pulse picked up, not out of fear, but something sharper, because something inside her, something buried, reacted. "That's not possible," she said. But her certainty lacked foundation, and Adrian noticed. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in calculation, because impossibility didn't exist in his world. Only hidden truths. "You tell me," he replied. And just like that, the power shifted again, because now the question wasn't his. It was hers. Alara's thoughts moved quickly, piecing together fragments she didn't fully understand. The tension she had carried for years. The feeling of being watched without knowing why. The parts of her past that never quite fit together. The gaps. The silence. The things no one ever explained. Her jaw tightened. "No," she said more firmly this time. "You're making a mistake." Adrian stepped closer again. Not threatening. Not aggressive. But deliberate. "Men like me don't make mistakes like this," he said. And that was the problem. Because she believed him. Not because she trusted him, but because everything about him felt exact, controlled, certain. And now, that certainty was focused entirely on her. A flicker of something crossed his expression then. Not weakness. Not hesitation. Memory. And for the first time, it wasn't subtle. It was sharp enough to leave a mark. "She had the same eyes," he said, almost himself. Alara stilled, because something about that detail felt too specific, too real. "And the same expression," he continued quietly, like she was always calculating something no one else could see. The words landed heavier than they should have, because they weren't just observations. They were recollections. And they didn't feel distant. They felt present, alive, Alara swallowed slowly, her thoughts tightening into something more focused. Who was she asked. Adrian's gaze snapped back to hers. This time, the tension was different. Not confusion, not uncertainty. Control reasserting itself. She doesn't matter anymore. The answer was final, closed, but it didn't feel true. And Alara knew it, because people didn't carry memories like that about things that didn't matter. Silence stretched between them again, but it wasn't empty. It was building, because now there were two forces at play. His need for answers, and her need for truth, and neither of them was willing to step back. Adrian turned slightly, his mind already moving ahead, processing, connecting, reconstructing possibilities. Then he made a decision. Run everything on her, he said sharply. The shift was immediate, cold, strategic, back to who he was. A man who saw problems, not questioned them. A voice responded from outside the door. Everything. Yes. A pause. Then, everything. The weight of that word settled heavily in the room. Because in Adrian's world, everything meant more than records. It meant digging, uncovering, destroying whatever stood in the way of the truth. Alara felt it, the shift in her role. She wasn't just a captive anymore. She was a variable, a risk, a mystery that needed to be solved, and that made her more dangerous than before. Am I supposed to just stand here while you investigate my existence? She asked. There was frustration in her voice now. Not fear, not weakness, but something sharper. Adrian looked at her again, and this time there was no hesitation left in his gaze, only focus. You don't have a choice, he said. The words were simple, but absolute, and yet something about the way he said them had changed, because it didn't feel like dominance. It felt like necessity, and that was far more dangerous. Alara exhaled slowly, forcing herself to stay grounded, because reacting emotionally here would be a mistake. Instead, she shifted her stance slightly, subtle but intentional. You're not treating me like a hostage, she said. Adrian didn't respond, but he didn't deny it either. You're trying to figure out what I am, she continued. A beat of silence. Then, yes. The honesty was unexpected, and it shifted something again, because this wasn't about control anymore. This was about truth, and truth, in a world like his, was the most dangerous thing of all. Alara's chest tightened, because if he was right, if there was something about her she didn't understand, then this wasn't just his problem. It was hers, and she had no control over it. That realization settled heavily in her mind, because control had always been the one thing she relied on, and now it was gone. Minutes passed, or maybe longer. Time had started to blur, because the tension in the room didn't ease. It deepened, until finally the door opened. A man stepped inside, holding a tablet. His expression was tight. Careful. Sir, he said. Adrian turned. The shift was immediate. Back to authority. Back to command. What is it? The man hesitated, just for a second. But that second said everything. Something's wrong. Adrian's eyes narrowed. Explain. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice slightly. We ran her identity through every system we have. A pause. And another hesitation. Stronger this time. Because whatever he was about to say wasn't normal. She exists, the man said. Records, history, everything checks out. Alara felt a small, unexpected sense of relief, until he continued. But Adrian's voice sharpened. But what? The man turned the tablet slightly, angling it toward him. There's another file. Silence. Heavy. Dangerous. Adrian's gaze dropped to the screen, and for the first time since she had entered that room, his control cracked. Not visibly, not dramatically, but enough for it to matter. Where did this come from? He asked. Buried archive, the man replied. Deep. Someone didn't want it found. Alara's pulse spiked, because now she knew this wasn't a mistake. This wasn't coincidence. This was something hidden, something intentional. Adrian's eyes scanned the file quickly, then stopped, completely. The room went still, because whatever he was looking at had just confirmed something. Something impossible. Slowly, he lifted his gaze back to Alara, and this time, there was no confusion left, no hesitation, only certainty. Cold, sharp, unavoidable. Alara's breath caught, because she had never seen a look like that before. Not directed at her. Not like this. "What is it?" she asked. Her voice was quieter now, not weaker, but aware, because she could feel it. Everything had just changed. Adrian didn't answer immediately, because the truth sitting in front of him didn't just challenge logic. It destroyed it. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, controlled, but carrying something far heavier. "This file," he said slowly, "was created 22 years ago." Alara's chest tightened. "And—" A pause. Then, "It belongs to someone who died the same year." The words landed hard, but not as hard as what came next. Adrian held her gaze, unmoving, unblinking, as he finished a sentence that would change everything, "and it has your face on it." The world didn't spin. It didn't shatter. It simply stopped, because in that moment, Alara Voss realized something far more terrifying than being kidnapped. The truth about her identity didn't just exist. It had been buried. The truth didn't explode. It settled, quiet, heavy, unavoidable. Alara stood in the same place, but nothing about her situation felt the same anymore. The file, the face, the impossible connection. It didn't just change what Adrian saw when he looked at her. It changed what she was, or at least what she might be. And in a world built on control, identity was everything. Adrian Cross understood that better than anyone, which was why, from that moment forward, everything about her treatment changed. Not gradually, not subtly, completely. An emotional hook tightened beneath the surface of her awareness. The most dangerous position in a ruthless empire isn't being hated. It's being protected without knowing why. Alara felt that truth before she could fully understand it. Because the next time she was moved, it wasn't with force. It was with precision, deliberate, controlled, and careful. The room she was taken to wasn't a cell. It wasn't luxurious either. But it wasn't confinement in the way she expected. It was secured, monitored, and, most importantly, untouched. No restraints, no threats, no unnecessary proximity. Just space. And that alone told her everything she needed to know. She wasn't just a captive anymore. She was something else. Something no one had explained. Outside the room, 2 guards stood at all times, not watching her like prey, but like something valuable, or dangerous, sometimes both. Alara noticed everything. The way they didn't speak to her, the way they avoided eye contact longer than necessary, the way they checked the locks twice instead of once. It wasn't fear. It was instruction. Clear, unspoken, absolute. No one touches her. The realization settled slowly, but once it did, it changed the way she saw everything, including him, Adrian. She saw less of him now, but when she did, it was different. He didn't interrogate her, didn't demand answers, didn't push. Instead, he observed, watched, as if trying to solve something that refused to stay still long enough to be understood. And that made him more dangerous than before, because silence from a man like Adrian Cross wasn't restraint. It was calculation. Days passed, or maybe only hours. Time had started to blur inside walls that didn't shift, under rules that weren't spoken but always enforced. Alara adapted, because survival wasn't new to her. But this wasn't survival in the way she understood it. There was no immediate threat, no clear enemy, no predictable outcome. Just tension, constant, pressing, and centered entirely on her existence. She began to watch him the way he watched her, not openly, never directly, but carefully, noticing patterns, absences, changes. Adrian was still the same man to everyone else. Cold, precise, untouchable, orders given without hesitation, decisions made without delay. But when it came to her, there was a fracture, small, almost invisible, but real and growing. One evening, She caught it more clearly than before. She had been standing near the window, if it could even be called that, more of a reinforced opening than a view. When the door behind her opened, she didn't turn immediately, didn't react, because she already knew who it was. The air changed when he entered, not louder, not heavier, just defined. Adrian stepped inside without a word. His presence alone filled the room. Illyria turned slowly this time, meeting his gaze without hesitation. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't empty. It was loaded with questions, with tension, with something neither of them had named yet. "You're adjusting," Adrian said finally. It wasn't praise. It wasn't observation. It was acknowledgement. Illyria tilted her head slightly. "I don't have much of a choice." Adrian studied her, longer than necessary, as if measuring the truth in that statement. "Everyone has a choice," he said. Her lips pressed into a faint line. "Then this is mine." A quiet defiance. Not loud, not reckless, but steady. And again, that flicker returned. Brief, controlled, but undeniable. Something in him responded to that. Not dominance, not anger. Something else. Something far more complicated. Adrian stepped closer, not invading her space, but narrowing the distance just enough to change the atmosphere. "You're not being treated like the others," he said. Illyria didn't look away. "I notice." A pause. Then, "Why?" The question landed clean, direct, and this time, Adrian didn't answer immediately, because the truth wasn't simple, and simplicity was the only kind of truth he usually dealt in. Instead, he looked at her again, not as a puzzle, not as a threat, but as something that refused to fit into either category. "That's what I'm trying to figure out," he said, and for the first time, that was the closest thing to honesty she had heard from him. It didn't comfort her. It unsettled her, because uncertainty in a man like Adrian Cross was more dangerous than certainty. Illyria exhaled slowly, her thoughts sharpening. "You don't treat unknowns as carefully," she said. Adrian's gaze hardened slightly. "No," he agreed. "Then I'm not an unknown." Another pause, this one longer. He didn't deny it, because he couldn't. Not anymore. And that alone told her more than anything else could. The power dynamic between them had shifted. Not evenly, not safely, but undeniably. She wasn't beneath him, not in the way others were. She wasn't above him either, but she existed in a space. That didn't have a name yet, and that made her dangerous. To him, to his world, to everything he controlled. The silence returned, but it didn't feel the same, because now there was awareness on both sides, and awareness changed everything. Adrian turned slightly as if preparing to leave, but he stopped, just for a moment. Without looking back, he said, "No one will harm you here." The words were quiet, controlled, but absolute, and then he left, the door closing behind him with that same quiet finality. Illyria didn't move immediately, because something about that sentence stayed, not as reassurance, but as weight, because protection, in a place like this, was never free, and it was never without consequence. Days continued to blur, but the tension didn't fade. It deepened, because outside her isolated space, the world was shifting, and she could feel it, in the footsteps, in the lowered voices, in the way guards changed more frequently, in the way no one lingered longer than necessary. Something was building, and she was at the center of it, even if no one said out loud. But someone else had noticed, someone outside these walls, because power never moved quietly for long, and secrets never stayed buried forever. Far from where Illyria stood, in a different part of the city where shadows held more weight than light, a conversation unfolded that would change everything. A name had surfaced. Her name, attached to something far more dangerous than anyone expected. "Are you certain?" a voice asked, low and measured. The man across from him nodded once. No mistake. A pause. Then a slow, dangerous smile. "So Adrian Cross finally has something to lose." The words settled like a promise, because in their world, weakness wasn't forgiven. It was exploited, And for the first time in years, Adrian had won. Her, back in the secured room, Elara stood still, unaware of the exact details, but not unaware of the shift, because something inside her, that same instinct that had warned her before, was screaming again, louder this time, closer. She moved toward the window, her gaze narrowing slightly as if trying to see beyond what was visible, because deep down, she knew this wasn't just about who she was. It was about what she meant, to him, to them, to something much bigger than she had ever been part of. And as that realization settled in, so did something far more dangerous. The understanding that her existence wasn't just a mystery anymore. It was about to become a weapon in a war she never chose. By the time the truth arrived, it no longer felt like an answer. It felt like a threat. The air inside Adrian Cross's world had already begun to shift, subtle fractures forming beneath a structure that had never allowed weakness. The tension Elara sensed was no longer contained within guarded hallways or lowered voices. It had spread into decisions, into silence, into him, because Adrian had not stopped investigating. He had accelerated. An emotional hook tightened beneath the surface of everything unfolding. The most dangerous secrets aren't the ones hidden from the world. They're the ones someone was willing to kill to erase. And Elara was beginning to understand. She wasn't just hidden. She had been erased. The results came late, not because they were difficult to find, but because someone had made sure they stayed buried. Adrian stood alone when the final file was brought to him. No witnesses, no interruptions, because whatever this was, he already knew it would change everything. The folder was thin, too thin. That alone was wrong, because a life, any life, left traces, records, history, connections. But Elara's had gaps, clean gaps, intentional ones. Adrian opened the file slowly, his expression unreadable, but his focus absolute. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency mattered more. He scanned the first page, then the next. Then he stopped, not abruptly, but completely, because the pattern had just revealed itself, not as chaos, as design. Elara Voss, he read quietly, a name that existed, but not originally, not fully. The file beneath it told a different story, one that had never been meant to surface. A birth record, altered, rewritten, reassigned, a different name buried beneath it, a different identity, and attached to that identity, a history that had been violently cut off. Adrian's jaw tightened, because now he understood this wasn't coincidence. This wasn't resemblance. This was replacement. Elara hadn't just looked like someone who died. She was connected to someone who had been eliminated, and that connection led directly back to him, across the compound. Elara felt the shift before she saw it, because the silence had changed again. Not tense, not watchful, but controlled in a different way, like something had already been decided. She sat still, her thoughts no longer scattered, but tightening around one unavoidable truth. Whatever they had found, it wasn't small. The door opened, and this time, Adrian didn't pause before entering. He moved with purpose, precision, finality. Elara stood slowly as he stepped inside, her gaze locking onto his instantly, and the moment she saw his expression, she knew this wasn't uncertainty anymore. This was confirmation. "What did you find?" she asked. No hesitation, no fear, because at this point, fear had been replaced by something sharper. The need to know. Adrian stopped a few steps in front of her. For a moment, he didn't speak, because the truth he now carried didn't just change her, it changed him. It changed everything. "You weren't taken by mistake," he said. The words landed with quiet force. Elara's chest tightened. "I figured that much." Adrian's gaze hardened slightly. "No," he said, "you don't understand." And that was when she felt it, the shift beneath the surface. Because this wasn't about why she was taken anymore. It was about why she had been allowed to exist at all. "You were supposed to be dead," he said. The sentence hit harder this time, because now it wasn't theoretical. It was fact. Elara's breath caught, her mind racing to catch up. That file, Adrian continued, wasn't just hidden. It was erased, rewritten, replaced. Each word tightened the pressure around her thoughts. Someone didn't just want you gone, he added. They wanted you forgotten. The room seemed to close in slightly, not physically, but mentally, because that kind of effort, that kind of precision, meant only one thing. She had mattered, enough to be removed. Illyra shook her head slightly, as if trying to ground herself. That doesn't make sense. Adrian stepped closer, and this time, there was no distance left between them. It does, he said quietly, when you see where it leads. A pause. Then, he said the name. Not hers. The other one. The one buried beneath everything. And the moment it left his mouth, something inside Illyra reacted. Not recognition. Not memory. Something deeper. Instinctive. Painfully familiar. Her body stiffened slightly. Because even without understanding it, she felt it. Adrian saw the reaction. And that was enough. Because it confirmed what the file had already suggested. The connection wasn't fabricated. It was real. You're not just connected to her, he said. You are her. The words didn't make sense. Not logically, not completely. But they didn't need to, because the implication was clear. Illyra's identity was not what she believed it to be. And suddenly, everything she had built her life on felt unstable. Her past, her memories, her existence. None of it felt certain anymore. That's not possible, she said. But the words lacked conviction, because somewhere deep inside, something had already started to break. Adrian didn't argue. He didn't need to, because the evidence spoke for itself. Instead, he shifted his focus, because this wasn't just about her identity anymore. It was about what that identity meant, and who had tried to destroy it. This wasn't an accident, he said, and it wasn't external. Illyra looked at him, confusion sharpening into something more focused. What does that mean? Adrian's gaze darkened. It means, he said slowly, this came from inside. The words settled heavily, because internal betrayal was the only thing Adrian Cross did not tolerate, ever. But this wasn't recent. This had been planned years ago, buried, protected, hidden beneath layers of loyalty and silence. Someone within his own world had orchestrated it and had succeeded. Until now, Illyra felt the shift again. The scale of what she was involved in expanding rapidly. This wasn't personal anymore. It wasn't just about her. It was about power, control, legacy, and whatever truth had been buried with that identity was dangerous enough to reshape all of it. Why? She asked. The question came out quieter this time, not weaker, just heavier, because now she understood the weight of it. Adrian didn't answer immediately, because the answer wasn't simple. It wasn't clean, and it wasn't finished. But one thing was clear. This wasn't about removing a person, he said. It was about removing a threat. Illyra's pulse quickened. A threat to what? Adrian's eyes held hers, unflinching, to everything. Silence followed, thick, unavoidable, because now the truth wasn't just unsettling. It was dangerous, and it was still incomplete. But Adrian already knew enough to understand the next step, enough to see the bigger picture. Because if someone had gone this far, to erase her, to rewrite her, then bringing her back into the open would not go unnoticed. And worse, it would not go unanswered. You being here changes things, he said. Illyra swallowed slowly. How? Adrian's expression hardened. Because whoever buried this truth, he said, is still out there. A pause. And they're going to realize very soon that it didn't stay buried. The weight of that settled between them. Because now, this wasn't about uncovering the truth. It was about surviving it. Illyra felt it clearly now. The shift from confusion to clarity. From victim to variable. From unknown to target. Because if she had been erased once, there was nothing stopping it from happening again. And this time, there would be no mistakes, no survival, no second chance. Adrian turned slightly, his mind already moving ahead, planning, anticipating, because this wasn't just a problem. It was a threat to his entire structure. And for the first time, that threat had a face. Her face. Behind them, the door opened again. A man stepped in quickly, his expression tense. "Sir," he said, "we have movement." Adrian didn't look surprised. "From where?" The answer came fast. "Internal channels. Old alliances are shifting. Someone's asking questions." A pause. Then, "They know." Silence. Sharp. Final. Because that was it. The moment the truth stopped being hidden and started becoming a weapon, Adrian's gaze returned to Alara. And this time, there was no distance left between understanding and reality. Because now, he saw it clearly. Not just what she was, but what she meant, and what it would cost. Keeping her alive wasn't just dangerous. It was catastrophic, because the truth tied to her existence had the power to fracture everything he controlled. And as that realization settled in, so did something far more dangerous. The understanding that protecting her might mean destroying his own empire. The moment the truth surfaced, the world didn't slow down. It accelerated. What had once been contained within quiet walls and controlled movements now began to ripple outward, through alliances, through shadows, through people who had been waiting for something exactly like this. And at the center of it all was her. Alara Voss was no longer a hidden variable. She was a disruption, and Adrian Cross was no longer treating her like one. An emotional hook settled deep into the shifting tension. Power doesn't corrupt the strongest men, attachment does. And Adrian was beginning to understand that too late, because something inside him had already changed. Not visibly, not openly, but fundamentally. He had spent years building a system where nothing mattered more than control. Every decision calculated, every risk measured, every weakness eliminated before it could take shape. And yet, Alara remained, not eliminated, not controlled, but protected. At first, it had been strategic, necessary, a matter of understanding what she was and what she meant. But now, that reasoning no longer held, because the protection hadn't decreased. It had intensified. The guards outside her space doubled, then rotated more frequently, then replaced entirely with men Adrian trusted beyond loyalty, men who didn't question, didn't hesitate, didn't fail. Orders became sharper, shorter, absolute. No one approaches her without clearance. No one speaks to her without reason. No one even looks too long. And most importantly, no one touches her. It wasn't policy anymore. It was law. And everyone felt it. Confusion spread quietly through the ranks. Because Adrian Cross did not protect individuals. He protected power. And right now, he was treating her like both. Alara noticed. Of course she did. She noticed everything. The shift wasn't subtle anymore. It was structured, intentional, and suffocating in a different way. Because protection, when it came without explanation, felt like another form of control. She moved through her confined space with growing awareness. Her thoughts no longer centered on escape, but on understanding. Because escape from this, without knowing what she was, would be meaningless. Her reflection in the glass caught her attention one evening, not because of how she looked, but because of what she couldn't see. The past, the truth, the person she was supposed to be, or had been. Her fingers hovered near the surface, but didn't touch, because the person staring back at her no longer felt entirely hers. And that realization was more terrifying than anything Adrian could have done to her. The door opened behind her. She didn't turn immediately. She didn't need to. The silence that followed told her everything. He was there. Adrian stepped inside without announcing himself. He didn't need to. His presence alone carried enough weight. But something about it had changed. Not less dangerous. More focused. More personal. Alara turned slowly this time, meeting his gaze. And for a brief moment, the distance between them felt smaller than it should have. Not physically, but in something harder to define. Adrian's eyes moved over her, not with suspicion, not with calculation alone, but with something that lingered. Something he wasn't allowing himself to fully acknowledge. Because acknowledging it would mean admitting it existed. And that was a line he had never crossed. Until now. "You shouldn't be here," Elara said quietly. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was observation. Adrian didn't respond immediately, because she was right. He shouldn't be. Not this often. Not without reason. Not without purpose. And yet, he was. Again, I need to know you're still here, he said. The words came out before he could reshape them, before he could make them colder, safer. And the moment they settled between them, something shifted, because that wasn't control. That wasn't strategy. That was something far more dangerous. Elara's brows pulled together slightly, not confused, not surprised, but aware. You think I'm going to disappear? She asked. Adrian's gaze hardened. Someone already tried to make sure you did. The reminder cut through whatever softness had started to form, because this wasn't simple. This wasn't safe. This wasn't something either of them could afford to misunderstand. But still, the shift remained, unspoken, unresolved. Elara took a slow breath, grounding herself. Then this isn't protection, she said. It's containment. Adrian stepped closer, not aggressively, but deliberately. It's both. And that was the truth, because keeping her safe also meant keeping her where he could see her, control her environment, limit variables, reduce risk. But somewhere along the line, it had stopped being just about risk and started being about her. That was the problem. That was always the problem. Elara felt it clearly now, the change in him, the way his attention lingered, the way his decisions bent, just slightly around her existence. And for the first time, she understood something critical. She mattered, not just as a mystery, not just as a threat, but as something that affected him and that gave her power. Not loud, not obvious, but real, dangerously real. Her voice softened slightly, not weak, but measured. You're changing things because of me. Adrian didn't deny it, didn't confirm it either. But silence, in his case, was always an answer. And that answer was enough. Outside the walls of his control, the world was reacting. Because secrets didn't stay contained. Not when they were tied to power. And Elara was becoming exactly that. Reports came in faster now. Movements. Questions. Names resurfacing from places Adrian had already buried. Old alliances shifting. New ones forming. And at the center of it, a single consistent detail. Her. They weren't guessing anymore. They were targeting. The first attempt came quietly. Too quietly. A breach that shouldn't have been possible. One guard. Compromised. Replaced. Not by force. By infiltration. It was subtle. Precise. Almost successful. Almost. Adrian found out before it was completed. Because unlike everyone else, he wasn't watching the system. He was watching her. And the moment something fell off, he acted. The response was immediate, brutal, final. The compromised guard never spoke, never had the chance. And from that moment forward, everything changed again. Security tightened beyond reason, movement restricted, access eliminated. Because this was no longer about potential risk. This was confirmation. They were coming for her. And Adrian was not willing to let them succeed. That realization settled deep within him. Unavoidable, unwelcome, but undeniable. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't protecting power. He was protecting a person. And that person was becoming his only vulnerability. Elara felt the shift instantly. The change in atmosphere. The increase in presence. The tightening of control. She didn't need to be told. She understood. They had found her. And now, she wasn't just a secret. She was a target. Fear surfaced then. Not overwhelming. Not paralyzing. But real. Because this was bigger than her. Bigger than Adrian. Bigger than anything she had been prepared for. And yet, she didn't break. Because something else had taken root alongside that fear. Trust. Not complete. Not blind. But growing. Because despite everything, despite the control, the silence, the danger, Adrian had not let anything touch her. Not once. And that meant something. Even if she didn't fully understand what. Adrian stood at the edge of the room again later that night, his expression darker than before, more resolved. because the situation had moved beyond calculation. It had become personal, and personal decisions were the most dangerous kind. You were right, Elara said quietly, her gaze steady. They're coming. Adrian didn't look surprised. I know. A pause. Then, you should let me go, she added. The words were calm, logical, strategic, because she understood now her presence here was the problem. Adrian's gaze snapped to hers. Sharp, immediate. No. The answer came too fast, too final, and that alone said everything. Elara held his gaze. Keeping me here puts everything at risk. Adrian stepped forward, slow, deliberate, and letting you go guarantees you won't survive it. Silence, heavy, unavoidable, because they both knew he was right. But that wasn't the point. The point was what he was willing to risk and what he wasn't. Adrian's voice dropped slightly, quieter, but far more dangerous. I don't lose things that matter, he said. And this time, there was no ambiguity, no distance, no control left to hide behind, because that wasn't strategy, that wasn't power, that was obsession. And the moment it settled between them, everything changed, because now it wasn't just about protecting her, it was about keeping her, no matter the cost, no matter the consequence, no matter what it destroyed in the process. And Adrian Cross, a man who had built his empire on discipline, had just crossed the one line he was never meant to cross. He turned away slightly, already issuing silent decisions in his mind, because there was only one way forward now. Not balance, not compromise, but choice. And when he spoke again, his voice carried something final, something irreversible. Prepare everything, he ordered. No explanation, no hesitation, just decision, because Adrian had chosen, not his empire, not his alliances, not his control, her. And as that decision settled into motion, it became clear that protecting Elara Voss would come at the cost of everything he had ever built. War didn't arrive with an announcement. It unfolded, quietly at first, through whispers, through broken alliances, through movements that didn't follow old patterns. And then it erupted, not because someone pulled a trigger, but because a truth buried for years had resurfaced. And that truth had a face. Elara Voss. An emotional hook settled into the chaos that followed. Some wars aren't fought over power. They're fought over the truth that threatens to destroy it. And Elara had become that truth. It began with fractures. Alliances that had once been unshakable started to bend under pressure. Deals that had held entire territories in balance were suddenly questioned. Names that hadn't been spoken in years resurfaced, attached to new intentions, new strategies, new threats. Adrian's network didn't collapse, but it shifted, and for the first time in years, it wasn't fully under his control. Reports came in faster than they could be processed. Movements across territories. Interceptions of shipments that had once passed untouched. Messages sent without encryption, as if someone wanted them to be seen. This wasn't quiet sabotage. This was provocation. And everyone knew why. Her. Elara wasn't hidden anymore. Not truly. Her existence had leaked. And once it did, it spread like fire through dry ground. Because the implications of who she was, or what she represented, were too dangerous to ignore. Inside the compound, the tension had reached a breaking point. Security wasn't just tightened, it was militarized. Routes changed daily. Access points sealed and resealed. Trust became a currency more valuable than power. And even that was running out. Adrian stood at the center of it all, his presence still commanding, still controlled. But the pressure around him had begun to shift. Externally, he was still the same man, still decisive, still ruthless, still feared. But internally, there was strain, because control required predictability. And this was anything but predictable. Elara saw it, not in obvious ways, but in the details. The way he moved faster now, the way his decisions carried less patience, the way his attention, despite everything, kept returning to her, not as a distraction, but as a constant. because in a world where everything else was becoming unstable, she had become the center of it, and that made her dangerous to everyone, including him. She stood near the reinforced glass again, her reflection staring back at her, but this time she didn't look away, because something had changed inside her too. Fear hadn't disappeared, but it had evolved into awareness, into calculation, into something sharper, because survival wasn't enough anymore, not when survival itself was causing destruction. She turned slightly as Adrian entered. This time, there was no hesitation in her posture, no uncertainty in her gaze, because she understood something now that she hadn't before. She wasn't just caught in the middle of this war. She was the reason it existed. "They're not going to stop," she said. Adrian didn't respond immediately, because the answer was obvious. No, they weren't. "They've already chosen sides," she continued. "Even the ones who haven't said it yet." Her voice was steady, measured, different. Adrian noticed, because this wasn't the same woman he had taken days ago. This was someone adapting, evolving, becoming something else. "Yes," he said finally. A pause. Then, "They're waiting." Ilara's gaze sharpened slightly. "For what?" Adrian stepped closer, his expression hardening into something more strategic. "For a mistake." The words landed clearly, because that was how wars like this were fought, not through chaos, through opportunity. And right now, she was the opportunity. Ilara absorbed that quietly, because it confirmed what she already felt. Her presence here wasn't neutral. It was leverage. And whoever controlled that leverage, controlled the outcome. That realization settled deep, because it meant something she hadn't wanted to accept. She wasn't just a victim of this war. She was a piece in it, and pieces were moved, used, sacrificed, unless they learn how to move themselves. Her breathing slowed, not from calm, but from decision forming. "They're not just targeting you," she said. Adrian's eyes flicked toward her. "They're targeting me." He didn't deny it, because it was true. And more than that, it was a point. The war wasn't about removing Adrian, not entirely. It was about destabilizing him. And nothing destabilized power faster than vulnerability. Ilara, across the city, that strategy was already unfolding. Two factions had openly broken from neutral ground, not aligning with Adrian, not opposing him directly, but positioning themselves, waiting, watching, because whoever moved first would define the war. And behind them, someone else was already moving, quieter, more precise, the one who had started all of this, the one who had buried her once, and now was preparing to do it again. Back inside the compound, Ilara stepped away from the glass, not retreating, moving, intentional, because something inside her had shifted completely. She wasn't reacting anymore. She was thinking, strategizing, becoming something the war hadn't accounted for. "What happens if they get me?" she asked. Adrian's expression darkened instantly. "They won't." The answer came sharp, immediate, but it wasn't enough. "That's not what I asked." Silence, because they both knew there was always a possibility. No matter how controlled the environment, no matter how strong the defense, war didn't respect certainty. Adrian exhaled slowly. "If they get you," he said, "they control the narrative." Ilara nodded slightly, because that made sense. Truth wasn't power on its own. Control over truth was. "And if they control the narrative," she continued, "they control everything tied to it." Adrian didn't respond, because she was right, and that was the problem. The power dynamic had shifted beyond physical control. It had become informational, psychological, and whoever shaped the story would shape the outcome. Ilara's thoughts moved faster now, connecting, building, understanding, and for the first time, she saw the war clearly, not as chaos, but as structure. And within that structure, she saw her role, not as a victim, not as a passive element, but as something far more dangerous, a decision point. Her gaze lifted to Adrian again, and this time, there was no hesitation. "They don't want to kill me immediately," she said. Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. Explain. They want to use me, she continued, to expose something, to prove something, or to control something. A pause. And if that's true, her voice didn't waver, then I'm not just a target. Adrian finished the thought silently. You're the center. And that changed everything, because now the war wasn't just happening around her. It was happening because of her. Outside, another report came in, more aggressive this time. A convoy intercepted. One of Adrian's outer operations dismantled. Clean, efficient, a message, not hidden, not subtle. Escalation. Adrian processed it quickly, his expression hardening further, because now the war wasn't building anymore. It had begun. Fully, openly, irreversibly, and control was slipping. Not completely, but enough. Enough to matter. Enough to change the outcome if left unchecked. Illyria felt it. That shift, that instability. And for the first time, she understood something that changed everything. Adrian couldn't end this alone. Not anymore. Because this war wasn't just his. It was hers too, and that meant she had a role to play in how it ended. The realization settled heavily, but it didn't scare her. It clarified something, because for the first time since this began, she wasn't just reacting. She was choosing, and choice was power. Her voice was quieter now, but stronger, more certain. This doesn't end unless something changes, she said. Adrian looked at her, really looked this time. Because whatever she was about to say, he knew it mattered. They're not going to stop, she continued. Not until they get what they want. And what is that? He asked. Illyria held his gaze. Me. Silence. Because there it was. The truth. Unavoidable. Uncomfortable. Dangerous. Adrian's jaw tightened slightly. Because that meant one thing. As long as she remained here, the war would continue. Escalate. Spread. Destroy everything, unless something changed. Illyria exhaled slowly, and in that breath, a decision formed, not impulsive, not emotional, strategic, necessary, and terrifying in its simplicity, because there was only one way to end a war like this, not by fighting it, but by controlling what was being fought over. She stepped forward slightly, and for the first time, she didn't feel like someone trapped in his world. She felt like someone about to reshape it. There's only one way this ends, she said. Adrian's gaze sharpened. How? A pause. Then she answered, and the moment she did, everything shifted, because the solution wasn't safe. It wasn't controlled, and it wasn't something Adrian would accept easily, but it was a truth, and the truth was always the most dangerous weapon of all. Illyria's voice remained steady as the realization fully settled in. The only way to end the war was for her to choose a side. The decision didn't echo. It settled. Quiet, precise, irreversible. Illyria Voss stood at the center of a war she never chose. And for the first time since it began, she understood something no one else had fully grasped. This war wasn't about territory. It wasn't about dominance. It was about truth. And whoever controlled that truth controlled everything. An emotional hook cut sharply through the moment. The most powerful people aren't the ones who start wars. They're the ones who decide how they end. And Illyria had just become one of them. The meeting was arranged quickly, not through negotiation, through necessity, because the war had reached a point where silence was no longer sustainable. Too many losses, too many fractures, too much instability spreading across a system that had once thrived on control. Now, it demanded resolution. The location was neutral, or as close to neutral as their world allowed. An abandoned structure on the edge of contested territory, far enough from power centers to prevent immediate retaliation, close enough to matter. They all came. Adrian's faction, the fractured alliances, the observers who had waited too long to remain uninvolved, and the ones who had started this, hidden behind calculated distance, but present, watching, waiting, because no one ignored a shift like this, not when it involved her. Illyria, she didn't arrive behind Adrian. She didn't stand beside him either. She walked ahead, not as a shield, not as bait, but as something entirely different. A decision. The moment she stepped into the center of that room, the noise died without command, because they saw it, not just her, but what she represented. The truth they had all been circling, the leverage they had all been fighting for. And now, it was standing in front of them, unhidden, unprotected, by choice. Adrian stood behind her, not distant, not overshadowing, present, but not leading. And that alone changed everything. Because Adrian Cross had never stood behind anyone. Until now, the silence stretched. Heavy, expectant, waiting for someone to make the first move. But Alara didn't wait. She stepped forward. And with that single step, she took control. "This ends now," she said. No raised voice, no force. But it carried, because authority didn't always come from power. Sometimes it came from certainty. A man from the opposing side stepped forward, his expression guarded, calculating. "You don't get to decide that," he said. Alara's gaze didn't waver. "I already have." The confidence in her voice didn't come from arrogance. It came from understanding, because she had seen what they hadn't. The structure beneath the chaos. The truth beneath the war. "You've all been fighting over the same thing," she continued. "Me." A ripple of tension moved through the room. Not disagreement. Recognition. Because denying it now would be pointless. "And you still don't understand why," she added. That shifted something. Because now, this wasn't just confrontation. It was exposure. Adrian watched her carefully, not intervening, not controlling, because he understood what this moment was. Not his, hers, and she was handling it exactly the way it needed to be handled. Alara turned slightly, letting her gaze move across the room, taking them in, reading them, understanding them, the same way they had tried to understand her. "You think I'm leverage," she said. "A weakness, a way to destabilize him." Her eyes flicked briefly toward Adrian, then back. "But I'm not." A pause. Then, "I'm the truth you buried." The words landed heavier than anything else she had said, because that was the core of it. Not power, not control. Truth. And truth couldn't be negotiated. "You erase me," she continued, her voice steady but sharper now. "Changed my name, rewrote my history, made sure no one would ever find what I was connected to." A silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was tightening, because now the past wasn't hidden anymore. It was standing in front of them. "And now you're trying to control what that truth means," she said. The man stepped forward again. "And what does it mean?" he challenged. Alara didn't hesitate. "It means you failed." The impact was immediate, because failure in their world was never small. It was fatal. "You didn't erase me," she continued. "You delayed me." The words settled deep, and for the first time, the balance shifted completely. Because now, she wasn't something to be controlled. She was something that couldn't be undone. Adrian saw it clearly. The shift, the recalculation. Because this was no longer a war over possession. It was a war over consequence. And Alara had just changed what that consequence looked like. "You want control?" she said. Her voice lowered slightly. More focused, more dangerous. "Then accept the truth." No one spoke, because the alternative was escalation. And escalation would destroy everything. Adrian stepped forward then, not to take over, but to stand beside her, equal. And that was the final shift, because his control was no longer built on fear. It was built on alignment, on truth, on something far more stable than dominance. "We end this," he said. Simple, clear, final. And this time, no one challenged it, because the war had already turned. Slowly, carefully, the tension began to break, not disappear, but transform. Agreements unspoken, lines redrawn, power redistributed, not through violence, but through understanding, because the truth had forced them into something none of them expected. Balance, temporary, fragile, but real. Alara stood still as it settled, not overwhelmed, not uncertain, but aware, because this wasn't victory. It was transformation, and she was at the center of it. For the first time in her life, she understood who she was. Not the name she had been given, not the identity that had been constructed, but the truth beneath it. And she accepted it, not as something that controlled her, but as something she controlled. She turned slightly, her gaze meeting Adrian's. And this time, there was no confusion, no distance, no imbalance. What had once been a forced connection had become something else entirely. A choice, not made out of necessity, but understanding. "You didn't lie to me," she said quietly. Adrian held her gaze. "No." A pause. Then, "You just carried the truth alone." He didn't deny it, because that had always been the difference. And now, that difference was gone, because she carried it too, equally. The space between them shifted, not into dominance, not into submission, but into something far more dangerous. Partnership, chosen, earned, real. And in that moment, everything they had been changed, because they were no longer bound by circumstance. They were aligned by truth. But truth never ended anything. It only reshaped what came next. As the room slowly cleared and the war dissolved into something quieter, something more controlled, Alara felt again. That same instinct, that same awareness. Not gone, not finished, because power, once revealed, didn't disappear. It attracted, and somewhere beyond what she could see, something else had already taken notice. Her gaze shifted slightly, scanning the edges of the emptying space. And for just a moment, she felt it. Not presence, not movement, but attention, focused, intentional, watching, waiting. Her expression stilled, because deep down, she understood something critical. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something else, something bigger, something more dangerous, because the truth she had revealed hadn't just ended a war. It had created a new kind of power, and power like that never went unchallenged. As Alara turned away, stepping into the future she had just reshaped, she realized the most dangerous part of all. Someone new had been watching her rise, and they were already preparing to take everything from her.